After 2.5 months in Submechanophobia, the Bobby Dots conclusion, the 5th of the Tales from the Pizzaplex books, has finally released. In this video, I'm going to be doing a summary on the first story in the book titled GGY. This story has a huge lore drop that I'll touch on briefly at the end of this video and go in depth on in a theory video once I'm done with all of the stories. Speaking of, as always, I'm going to be doing summary videos on both the other stories in the book titled The Storyteller and Bobby Dots Part 2, as well as the epilogue for the book, so stay tuned for those as well. But for now, I think it's finally time to go in depth with GGY. The main character of GGY is Tony, a 12-year-old kid who wants to grow up to be an investigative reporter in the future. He loved using his writing skills for non-fiction work in preparation for his goal, but his teacher, Mrs. Soto, had been focusing on fiction, which he didn't like. The story begins with a huge storm outside, and Tony had thought that he'd seen something moving in the rain. He thought it was an elongated human-sized shape that was slithering through the rain, but since they were on the second floor, that would be impossible. He was tempted to look out the window to see if anything had fallen to the ground, but getting out of the seat would probably prompt a dirty look from Mrs. Soto. Tony watched lightning outside strike a tree near the school, causing him to believe that that was what he had seen. He had zoned out, and his best friend had to get his attention to pass him their next assignment. He handed a sheet to a popular pretty blonde girl that sat next to him, who was in the big leagues compared to him, who probably wouldn't be caught dead talking to someone as low in the school society as Tony. And that's not to say that Tony didn't have friends, but he wasn't exactly popular. As it turns out, the assignment that had just been passed around was a fiction assignment, which Tony hated since, as I said before, he loves non-fiction writing. But for the assignment, you were to create a fictional story in groups of 3 with multiple subplots that seem irrelevant but are integral to the main plot. Tony's friends always liked to make up fake names whenever they got a new assignment. One of his friends named himself Boots based on Puss in Boots as he is a clever cat. The other friend named himself Dr. Rabbit, or Rab for short. And Tony named himself Tarbell after Ida Tarbell, a famous muckraker in the late 19th to early 20th centuries, though he didn't bother to explain that part to his friends. Tony wanted to get with his friends and discuss their story, but they instead wanted to go to the Pizzaplex and play on the arcades. They were able to convince him and they went. The Fastcade was Tony's favorite part of the Pizzaplex, with all the sick music from DJ Music Man and all the different arcade games. However, because he wanted to work on the story, these sounds were kinda annoying today. After playing a few games, Tony stopped and began watching people around him play, looking for ideas for the story. We also find out that Tony's dad had actually been a convicted felon accused of embezzling money from the corporation that he worked for and being sentenced to 20 years in prison. When he had been younger, he made his own stories about things in his neighborhood, but his parents discouraged it because of something that happened to one of the men he wrote about because of what he wrote about him. However, when his dad went to prison, Tony had wanted more than ever to know the truth. He wanted the answers to unsolved questions, and he hated unsolved questions, so he always wanted to find the answers. As he was walking around the Fastcade, he found a couple girls playing against each other at a pinball machine. Their scores were higher than all the high scores on the game, most being in the low millions, while theirs were above 5 million. Except just one. A user named GGY had gotten 50 million points, more than 10 times the amount as these girls. That was insane. He decided to look around and found GGY on some of the other arcades, and they had always been in the top spot, with impossibly high scores. This was the kind of mystery that Tony liked. He needed to figure out who GGY was and how they got that many points in all these games. He returned to the black-haired girl and the redhead who were playing pinball that he saw before, and he asked them if they knew who GGY was, but they said that they had no idea. However, they knew a guy named Axel who might know who GGY is and directed Tony to him. Tony returned to his friends who had wondered where he was, and Tony was really excited to dive deep into this GGY mystery. He returned to the Pizzaplex on his own 2 days later, Sunday, and on Sundays the Fastcade was pretty much full as the animatronics would go there and hang out, and while Tony was walking around searching for Axel, he came across Monty breakdancing, which is kind of funny. Eventually he found Axel and asked if he knew who GGY was. It turns out that Axel didn't know who GGY was, and apparently no one else had seen him play. Tony then ran into a random employee named Finbar, who we got to talking with before he noticed a pigtailed girl from school named Amelia playing a Fruity Maze arcade game and raging at it. Finbar had to deal with that, calling in an older security guard who escorted her out, giving Finbar and Tony dirty looks as she was escorted out, and Finbar and Tony got back to talking, and Tony told him about his goal to figure out who GGY is. Finbar guessed that he was probably one of the only Pizzaplex employees who actually knew about GGY and their impossibly high scores. However, he actually revealed that the games had no sign of being hacked and were exactly as they should be. Tony asked if Finbar thinks maybe GGY is sneaking in and playing after hours. Finbar explained that a key card gets you to the employees only areas, but if an employee loses a card, then maybe you'd be able to use it once or twice, if that, but it'll just be deactivated as soon as possible. They also don't get you into the building, security badges do, and those are even more closely guarded. Some of the employees were a bit careless with this stuff though. So anyway, Finbar had to go deal with someone else, and although he was nice, he wasn't all that helpful. He'd only been informed that GGY hadn't been hacking, and even that might not have been true because some hackers are just that good. But Tony couldn't solve the mystery today as he had to go home for dinner. He did notice some other kids though, Wes and Dana, talking about GGY as well, and he approached them and he told them about how GGY wasn't hacking, and Dana said that she wondered why GGY wasn't on any forums. As Tony was about to leave, he noticed Glamrock Freddy was staring at him. He just thought it was a friendly gesture and waved at Freddy, but Freddy didn't wave back. Freddy was still staring as Tony exited the Fazcade. A week goes by with Tony unable to learn anything. However, his conversation with Dana did give him an idea to join forums and ask if people knew the top scorers. None of the responses were helpful, but one user named Morrigan99 questioned why he was asking about people. Tony told them that he was curious about GGY, and Morrigan told them that they would message him on a different forum tomorrow at the same time. Tony decided it was possible that the Pizzaplex had some kind of record of GGY that maybe Finbar didn't know about. He'd recently noticed an employee leave their kiosk without logging out, so Tony's plan was to wait for something like that to happen again so that he could use the kiosk and look through the records. He also needed to find a careless employee's keycard, which he thought would probably be pretty easy. He and his friends went to the Pizzaplex the next day, but Tony split off from them and carried out a plan where he tripped and fell next to an employee named Kathy, prompting her to try and help him while he grabbed her keycard without her noticing. He used this keycard to get into the kiosk where he began searching for GGY. He found that GGY had a hacked play pass. Play passes were supposed to just be for common players to play without tokens, but GGY's had the perks of a security badge as well. There was also a list of 3 names of people that GGY had let into the Pizzaplex with his play pass. He saw one was Mary, but the other 2 he couldn't make out in full. One was Ray something and the other was Trey something. Tony was about to stand to get a better look at the names before he saw the back of a Pizzaplex employee outside the window next to him. So he decided to leave the room and found that no one saw him, which was good, except what wasn't good was that he once again caught a glimpse of Glamrock Freddy. But what was weirder was that Glamrock Freddy was literally following Tony. He worried Freddy had seen him at the kiosk and that maybe he would report or confront him. He was eventually able to lose Freddy, when he went to the Fazcade and went back to join his friends again, and we got to 10 PM that night when Tony saw that he got a private message from Morrigan99. They asked what Tony knew about GGY, and Tony told them that GGY has a hacked Pizzaplex play pass and can go anywhere in the Pizzaplex. Morrigan then said, "Not bad for a little kid," then said, "I know who you are, you're playing with fire." Then they told Tony to meet them under the bleachers at the high school in 30 minutes, then went offline. It was raining outside, so Tony grabbed his rain jacket, and he also grabbed a small flashlight and a metal baseball bat just to be safe. It would be easy to sneak out as Tony's mom was asleep and his grandma was hard of hearing and had the TV turned up really loud, which would drown out any noise of him sneaking out. So he went to the high school bleachers and found that Morrigan99 was actually the black-haired girl from earlier who was playing pinball with her friend. This girl's name was Crystal, and she tells Tony that she thinks looking into GGY could be dangerous. Crystal actually enjoys to hack, but not in a sinister way, just for fun. But once she decided to look at the code for the Glamrock animatronics, but she found something strange. There were some lines of code that weren't in the legitimate coding, and in those lines were random G's and Y's. This is something programmers do as a sort of signature, and this one was left by a hacker, not a programmer. Crystal doesn't really care about this stuff, but she would have felt bad if she didn't warn Tony about all this. Once she finished explaining, she left. On Sunday, Tony's mom and grandma brought him to the Pizzaplex thinking they were doing him a favor, but when he noticed Glamrock Freddy staring at him, he told them he was sick and had to go home. That night, he began working on the story, which he always pretty much did all of, and his friends didn't seem to care much about the story even after what Tony told them he'd discovered. But Tony didn't have too big of a problem with that since he'd loved writing. He wrote about all his discoveries about GGY manipulating the animatronics and finished off the story by Wednesday. When Tony finished writing, he listened to the commercials that he could hear from his grandma's TV a few rooms down. A news anchor started talking about the disappearance of a school counselor that disappeared nearly 5 months ago. Tony could sense a memory that was trying to reach the forefront of his thoughts, but he couldn't figure it out. The next day, he showed his friends the story. Rab said that he would read it later, and Boots read it as they walked through the halls. However, he didn't seem to enjoy it as much as Tony thought that he would. If they needed any changes, they would have to get them done tonight since the stories had to be turned in the next morning, so Boots said that he and Rab would work on it tonight. Tony was a bit tired of this and decided that he'd probably talk about it with Mrs. Soto before the next assignment. The next day, Tony was doing some work for a neighbor when it finally clicked. See, what I didn't mention about that disappearance of the school counselor was that school counselor was named Mary Schneider. Mary. And Tony finally put together that the Mary that GGY led into the Pizzaplex could have been the one that went missing. Since Mary is a common name, Tony thought maybe it was a bit of a stretch to connect the two, but it really wasn't. He and Crystal both believed that GGY was up to something at the Pizzaplex, and Mary Schneider went missing, so it's possible GGY was the reason that she did. When he finished the work on his neighbor's house, he started pedaling home and thought intently. He thought that GGY was probably a kid, meaning he probably went to his school, meaning he'd likely know Mary Schneider, and it's possible that he'd had a problem with her for some reason. Tony knew that he had to learn more about Mary Schneider, so he turned his bike around and pedaled toward his school. There had been a crack in the foundation of the school that Tony and his friends knew about that allowed one to shift the limestone and get into the building. Tony was able to get inside the school and he headed to Mrs. Hawkins' office in the back of the library. Mrs. Hawkins was a school librarian and her office couldn't be locked and the computers should have the school records, making it perfect for him to investigate Mary Schneider on there. He made it to the school personnel records and clicked on counselors. Only 4 of the school's counselors had been within the last couple years, which he figured were the most relevant ones since the Pizzaplex hadn't been around before then. This places this story 3 years before Security Breach, since we know from the Fast Life magazines that the Pizzaplex had to have been open for 5 years prior to Security Breach, and a couple means 2, so this story is 2 years after the Pizzaplex opened, and therefore 3 years before Security Breach. Mary Schneider had worked as a counselor the longest, which had been for 3 years prior to her disappearance. Another counselor, Raylan Lawrence, had replaced Mary Schneider following her disappearance, but had only worked there for a month. This is the Ray that was mentioned earlier on the kiosk. The Trey from that kiosk had been Trina Welch, who replaced Raylan Lawrence but worked there for a mere 7 weeks. The school had been without a counselor for a few weeks before Georgia Lowe started a month ago. Looking at Mary's file, Tony found that it had said that she was missing and her disappearance was under investigation. This wasn't a surprise, however, when he looked at Raylan and Trina's files, he found that they had the exact same thing in their files. Both of them were missing too, and GGY's Play Pass had let both of them into the Pizzaplex. All 3 of these school counselors had been led into the Pizzaplex by GGY, and all 3 of them had gone missing. Tony knew that this wasn't a coincidence. Suddenly, there was a scuffling sound somewhere in the school. Tony thought maybe it was a rat. Now, I'm going to read you a quote from the story, and I think you'll be able to realize pretty simply what this is suggesting. Quote, "The counselors must have met with GGY, and maybe, one by one, they'd caught on to whatever GGY was doing at the Pizzaplex, and maybe other places too. Who knew what GGY was capable of? Clearly they were brilliant. Brilliance could be used for good and bad." Tony asked himself one of his favorite questions. What if? What if the counselors had discovered what GGY was doing? What if they'd known that they were onto him? And what if they'd lured them somehow to the Pizzaplex to do away with them? End quote. Yeah, I think it's pretty clear. GGY is Patient 46, and GGY seems to be Gregory since the name matches to a T, but do we know that for sure? Well, let's find out. The next day, Tony went to school to find that Rab and Boots had completely changed the story. Now, GGY was the favorite apprentice of a wizard from another planet that a corporate conspiracy had somehow reached, and GGY's control of animatronics turned into an animatronic supervillain that fought a giant tentacle monster. Sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? It's like the story of William Afton in Security Breach, the animatronic villain fighting the Blob, a giant tentacle monster. It's almost like someone is trying to cover up the whole thing about GGY, replacing it with the story of William Afton. But how would they know about that? Maybe because one of the members of the group is GGY. And who was it that came up with this new story? Rab. Rab is GGY. And this could also explain why he chose the name Dr. Rabbit. It could connect to Glitchtrap or William Afton since he's heavily associated with rabbits, obviously. But it goes even deeper than that. Because of this whole incident with them ruining his story, Tony no longer wants to call his friends by their joke story names. They didn't deserve that from him. Boots' real name was Ellis, and that's what he would be called. Later in the day, Tony was called down to the principal's office. Mr. Adkins, the principal, told Tony that he was caught on camera sneaking into Mrs. Hawkins' office. However, Tony knew where all the cameras were, and he stayed clear of them. He knew that somehow someone must have been in the school with him last night and ratted him out. Mr. Adkins told Tony that he has to go to the library for detention after school, and must explain to Mrs. Hawkins why he did what he did, and also must do any tasks that she wants him to do. Tony, of course, didn't tell Mr. Adkins the real reason as to why he did what he did, but he did go to the library after school and apologize to Mrs. Hawkins. Tony was one of Mrs. Hawkins' favorite students, so she wasn't upset. She knew Tony must have been investigating something, and she just gave him a minor task. However, he heard his name be called. It was Rab. There's just about a page of the story left, so I'll just read it out to you. Quote, "The story destroyer grinned at Tony. Boots said you weren't happy with the changes we made to your story," he said. "Sorry we did so much to it. We might have gotten carried away. We were just trying to make it more entertaining." Tony wanted to unload all the righteous indignation that he'd been carrying around all day, but that wouldn't have accomplished anything. He'd learned his lesson. He wouldn't be partnering with his friends on a story again. He'd find someone else in the class to work with. "Thanks, Greg," Tony said with exaggerated politeness. Like Ellis, Tony was done calling Greg by his nickname, Rab. It was Greg from here on out. When Greg didn't move off, Tony raised a hand and said, "See you tomorrow." Greg returned the wave. He smiled. Then he cocked his head and studied Tony for several seconds. For some reason, Greg's scrutiny made Tony want to squirm. Before Tony could figure out why he suddenly felt odd, Greg started to walk away. Tony let out a pent-up breath. Greg stopped and took a step back towards Tony. "Listen," Greg said, "how about you meet me at the Pizzaplex when you get out of here? In an hour or so? I have some people I want you to meet. We'll have some fun, and you'll forget all about the story and getting detention." Tony wasn't all that keen on going back to the Pizzaplex. He couldn't be in the place now without thinking about GGY and the modified animatronics. "Come on," Greg pressed. "Say yes. We'll get you cheered up." End quote. And that is the end of the story. So there you have it. Gregory is Patient 46. But to what extent is the Gregory we play as in Security Breach evil? Is Gregory as Patient 46 possessed by Glitchtrap? Is it an alternate robot of Gregory? Is it multiple of those things? Once I'm done all my summaries, I'll be doing a theory video going over everything to do with Patient 46 and Gregory. But let me know what you guys think about Gregory being Patient 46 in the comments down below. But anyways guys, I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, then make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to. But I will see you all in the next video. Bye guys!